What's up, Packer fans? Happy Sunday. Welcome into the Pack a Day podcast. I'm your host, Andy Herman. You can follow me on Twitter at Andy Herman NFL. Today, I figured it would be a fun exercise to just kind of run through and take a look at, kind of position by position and just overall from a team standpoint, which players that I think are lead pipe locks to make the 53-man roster as we sit here today on May 30th. So still a long ways to go before we kick off, training camp and final roster cutdowns and things like that. But I do think there's a good chunk of players that are really guaranteed roster spots already. And then when we kind of see that, we can kind of figure out, all right, how many roster spots are actually up for grabs and which ones, are in play as we get into our training camp breakdowns and things like that. So let's go position by position and just review, again, what I think are the locks to make the roster. Now, the quarterback is by far and away the most interesting one here. And I'm going to do this from a Packers standpoint, right? So from an everything is normal standpoint, I don't think we can 1,000,000% say that either Aaron Rodgers or Jordan Love are lead pipe locks to make the team. I still think there are avenues, however unlikely that they are. There's still at least a slim chance, if not more, that either Aaron Rodgers could retire or be traded, or that Jordan Love could be traded. I don't necessarily say that I'm leaning towards either of those, but I still think there's absolutely some question as to whether or not both will be on the 53-man roster when camp opens and certainly when the season starts. So it's really tough to peg that down. I'm going to say, just for the sake of saying it, that if everything's normal, that Aaron Rodgers and Jordan Love are locks to make the 53, right? I don't know that we can necessarily predict exactly what's going to happen outside of that. And if there will be a trade, again, that starts getting into muddy waters a little bit. But obviously, if everything is in a normal scenario, both Aaron Rodgers and Jordan Love are lead pipe locks. So for the sake of this exercise, I'm going to say that both of those are. I don't think Blake Bortles, certainly not Kirk Benkert, are anywhere near in that conversation to be locks to make the roster. Now, if Rodgers or if Jordan Love are gone, then Blake Bortles certainly gets in that conversation. At least it has a leg up on being that backup quarterback to whomever is the starter at that point in that situation. So we'll see what happens. But as we sit here today, based off of the roster that's in front of us and trying to kind of ignore the noise, I'm going to go with Aaron Rodgers and Jordan Love are as much locks as they can possibly be given the situation where things are at right now. So kind of skip over that one to an extent, just because, again, we could spend an entire podcast again talking about what could happen at quarterback, but the truth is none of us really know. So we're just going to jump over to running backs. Two running backs to me are locks to make the roster. Of course, that's Aaron Jones and A.J. Dillon. I think that number 3 and maybe even number 4 running back spot is going to be one of the ones that's more, really fun to watch as training camp and this offseason progresses. I think Kylan Hill has a really good chance. Patrick Taylor is somebody who's incredibly intriguing. Dexter Williams has hung around for a couple of years, former 6th-round pick. So, and then of course there's Mike Weber as well. So I think that group is going to be a really interesting one to figure out who gets the 3 and 4. If I were a betting man today, I would say Kylan Hill probably has a leg up, just being from a most recent draft pick and just kind of seeing him even at rookie mini camp and OTAs. Just a very clean mover, even looks strong enough to be able to protect in the blitz, clean hands, just a really interesting prospect. So that's where I lean today, but I don't think there's any way you can say anybody's a lock besides Aaron Jones and A.J. Dillon. All right, wide receiver. To me, there's 4 that are locks to make this roster, and that's Devontae Adams, Allen Lazard, MVS, and Amari Rodgers. So those 4 to me aren't going anywhere. There's no way they would move on from Lazard with how cheap his contract is. MVS is in the last year of his deal, still very cheap, still brings a lot to the table. They just drafted Amari, and Devontae's not going anywhere. 2 people who have the next leg up would definitely be Equanimeous St. Brown and Devin Funchess. I definitely think there is a world in which EQ and Devin Funchess are battling for that 5th roster spot, that 5th wide receiver spot, and then they would go with more of a younger, more special teams based wide receiver as the number 6 wide receiver. I think that absolutely could be the case. Maybe it's a Malik Taylor again. Maybe it's, who knows, a Reggie Begelton. Maybe somebody else steps up. Maybe one of the undrafted guys steps up. But I think there is an avenue where either Devin Funchess or EQ could not make the 53, so I'm not going to lock them in. But I'm going to go Devontae Adams, Allen Lazard, MVS, and Amari Rodgers are your locks at wide receiver. At tight end, I'm going to lock in 3. Definitely Robert Tonyan. Now that he signed his restricted free agent tender, he's not going anywhere. Mercedes Lewis, they just gave the new contract to. And of course, Josiah DeGuara not going anywhere either. I think Jay Sternberger's probably a fairly safe bet, but this is a pretty big offseason for him. And again, there's been some rumblings that maybe he hasn't made the best first impression. Still has a ton of upside. I still think Green Bay's hoping to develop him. Tight ends usually take a little longer to develop. And then Dominique Daphne's another one that's going to be really interesting. If they fall in love with Daphne and maybe they can get a late round pick for Sternberger, it wouldn't shock me if Sternberger got sent out for a pick if he didn't perform in camp. It also wouldn't shock me if Sternberger made it based off his third round pedigree, and Dominique Daphne got the short end of the stick, and they just couldn't keep 5 tight ends around. So I know DeGuara, Daphne more H back, but we're kind of combining them into one group here. But either way, I think at this point we can only lock in 3 with DeGuara, Lewis, and Robert Tonyan. Offensive line, I'm going to lock in 6 offensive linemen. Now, David Bakhtiari could potentially start the season on some sort of injured list, probably a PUP list, but I'm still going to go David Bakhtiari, Elton Jenkins, Josh Myers, Royce Newman, John Runyon Jr., and then Billy Turner. So those are the 6 that I'm locking in as, for sure, guys. Lucas Patrick, very much in the 95+% category here, but this is a group or a team that spent a lot of draft capital. Simon Stepaniak, Jake Hansen, Cole Van Lanen, of course, Newman and Myers. And, they've got some other interesting players like a Ben Braden, like a Yash Nijman, like those sort of players that, there's not many people that Green Bay could cut and actually have some cost savings with. And there's a chance if they can't get things done with Aaron Rodgers and Devontae Adams from a salary standpoint, they might have to release a couple guys just to have the money to kind of get through this season. Lucas Patrick would be one of those rare ones that they could actually move on from and save some money. We saw, John Runyon Jr. and Royce Newman getting some snaps with the ones in the interior of the offensive line at OTAs. So if I'm any sort of a betting person, I'm saying Lucas Patrick is like a 98% chance to make this roster. But listen, if they can cut Josh Sitton, if they can cut, some of these, other offensive linemen that they've cut during training camp before, they can certainly cut a Lucas Patrick as well. The cost savings isn't quite apples to apples, but again, they could get into a position where they need every penny they can get. And potentially with, again, all the players that they drafted along the interior of the offensive line in the last couple seasons, there's a scenario where you could see Lucas Patrick not getting brought back. Not a likely scenario. And then, you've got a Simon Stepaniak, some others that I think will have a real good chance to make the team, but I do think that they're going to have to earn it. Same thing with Cole Van Lanen. I don't think those guys will just be handed roster spots. So Bakhtiari, Jenkins, Myers, Newman, John Runyon Jr., Billy Turner are the 6, with Lucas Patrick being a good bet. Along the defensive line, I'm locking in 4 players: Kenny Clark, Kingsley Keke, Dean Lowry, and TJ Slayton. With Lowry's restructuring of his contract, it makes him a lock to make the team this year, so he's not going anywhere. TJ Slayton, again, they just selected in the 5th round. Kingsley Keke, Kenny Clark, obviously not going anywhere. So those are the 4 I am locking in. I do think Tyler Lancaster is a very good bet to make this team, but maybe not completely out of the realm of possibility if a Willington Prevalon or a couple of these other undrafted, defensive linemen over the last couple seasons step up. I don't think Lancaster's a lock, and they can get out of that deal. So likely yes, but I can't exactly lock him in at this point. Edge rusher, I can only lock in 3. Rashawn Gary, Preston Smith, and Zadarius Smith. Randy Ramsey brings a lot to the table as a special teams player, so he's going to have a really good chance. And Jonathan Garvin has the best upside of any of the other ones. Tipa Nalia is interesting, but he's really small. That's going to be an interesting player to keep an eye on. Those guys are going to be fighting for those 4th and 5th, edge rusher spots. Delonte Scott's another player that I know he's played defensive line. I think he's going to get more of a look at edge potentially this season. He's a player I have my eye on, but overall, I think you can only lock in 3 with Preston, Zadarius, and Rashawn Gary at this point. Inside linebacker, interestingly enough, it's a position that maybe doesn't have the overall top end talent and really the, really great depth, but I think there's 4 players you can pretty much lock in. Chris Barnes, Kamal Martin, Isaiah McDuffie, and Ty Summers, to me, are the 4 guys that are going to make this team. I mean, Chris Barnes is the starter at this point. Kamal Martin still has a ton of upside. Isaiah McDuffie, they just drafted. And then Ty Summers is somebody that's a core special teams player, has definitely a full grasp of seemingly of the defensive playbook already. He was very communicative, in the OTA last week. So he's definitely a player that I think is going to make the team as well. Again, special teams is huge there. So if I'm betting today, I think those 4 are all locks to make the roster. Oren Burks, all others definitely going to have to have work to do to make this roster. Cornerback, let's see. I'm going to go 4 guys here as well. Jair Alexander, Shamar Jean-Charles, Kevin King, and Eric Stokes. Not in order, obviously, but those are the 4 that I think you can lock in at corner. Jair Alexander, obviously all-pro. He's not going anywhere. They just signed Kevin King to the new contract. Eric Stokes, first-round pick, and then Shamar Jean-Charles, they just drafted as well. So those are the players I think you can lock in. Josh Jackson, KB Anento, Chandon Sullivan, all those sort of players. All pretty good bets, I think, or maybe not Ento as much, but Sullivan, Jackson definitely have a really good chance to make the roster, but I think they're going to have to fight for it. Sullivan, very similar to Lucas Patrick. He's just one of those players where he's making over $2 million, based off of what he was given as a restricted free agent. Yeah, it is over $2 million. So that's another one of those players where Shamar Jean-Charles looks good. If they feel good about their rookies, maybe Kadar Hallman steps up, something like that. Josh Jackson looks good. I definitely think there's an avenue where they could say, you know what, we're going to try to save some money and move on without Chandon Sullivan. Or maybe they release him from that $2 million deal, see if he gets claimed. If he doesn't, they try to bring him back on a more of a vet minimum type of deal. So we'll see what happens there. But I don't think Sullivan, Jackson, Kadar Hallman, KB Anento, any of those players can be looked at as locks at this point. Safety is probably the position where the most is up for grabs. I think Adrian Amos and Darnell Savage are the only 2 that I could lock in at this point. I do think Vernon Scott is a very good bet. I think Henry Black is going to be very much involved in that conversation. They don't have a ton of depth at that spot. Christian Uphoff is somebody that could be the leader in the clubhouse amongst the undrafted free agents to make a roster. And again, the lack of depth at safety certainly helps that. Will Redmond, probably also a very good bet here. Again, a lot due to special teams. He is one of their core special teams players. So I think he's actually a lot closer to being a lock than maybe people think. And when Adrian Amos moved into the box in OTAs, Will Redmond was the one lining up at safeties in that with Darnell Savage in that situation at safety. So I think Will Redmond has a really good shot, but only time will tell. And again, I don't think his talent overall, you can say like, oh, they just got to keep Will Redmond on the roster, but his special teams certainly helps with that. From a special team standpoint, I think only Mason Crosby. I just think it would be very shocking if they moved on from Mason Crosby at this point. Yeah, I just think that what he's done and the level of comfort that you have with him, it's really tough to replace that. I'd be shocked if he didn't make the roster. And then I think the punter battle and the long snapper battle are completely up for grabs. And it wouldn't even shock me if, the long snapper or punter weren't currently on the roster and they made some moves, during cut down time or waivers to, maybe shore up that position if they feel like they can get somebody better in that way as well. So right now, special teams, Mason Crosby, the only one that I can lock in. So if you look at that overall, that's 35 spots of the 53 only that I think you can lock in. And 2 of those with Aaron Rodgers and Jordan Love are at least a little bit interesting as well. I do think there's another handful of people: Tyler Lancaster, Lucas Patrick, Vernon Scott, Jay Sternberger, Chandon Sullivan, Will Redmond. I think even a Kylan Hill, I think that are very likely. That's 2, 4, 6, 7 more guys. So that brings you to maybe 42 guys that are at least really good bets or better. But that's still a lot of spots that are open on this team. There's some, real competition at some of these spots, like where, Devin Funchess and Equanimeous St. Brown are easily, 53-man roster capable, right? But just some of those competitions could force, one of those guys out and so on and so forth. So they definitely have some players that are going to be competing for spots here, and that could make a ton of noise and could end up being locked sooner rather than later. But as of right now, there's really only 35 that I can say, with pretty good conviction, with pretty strong conviction, are going to make the team. Some of the most intriguing battles, I think, that third running back spot, the backup offensive lineman, backup safety, the fourth edge rusher, and then really the overall cornerback competition. Who's the starters? We know Jair is one of them. Probably Kevin King's another, but how does that shake out? And then how does the depth behind them shake out as well? I think those are going to be all very interesting things to keep an eye on. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, make sure to subscribe and like. I appreciate it greatly. I'm going to be right back here tomorrow. Even though it's a holiday, we are 365 days a year. We do not stop. So make sure to, again, subscribe if you haven't and check that out. Make sure to check out today's audio podcast wherever you get your favorite podcasts. But until next time, and as always, go Pack Go.